Under the shimmering glow of post-war America, few stars burned as brightly or as briefly as Jayne Mansfield. She was the platinum promise of an age that worshipped beauty and consumed innocence, a creature caught between laughter and longing. On June 29, 1967, a car accident on a Louisiana highway silenced that promise forever. But history, like the ocean, holds many currents. So let us drift into another tide of time and ask gently, what if Jayne Mansfield had lived beyond Hollywood's golden age? Good evening, dear friends. Wherever you are, in the quiet of your living room, the hum of a car ride, or the stillness of a late-night walk, thank you for joining us. Leave a note of where and when you're listening, and if these echoes of history move you, consider subscribing so we may travel together through more lives, altered by time. The year is 1933. The world trembles between wars, and in a small town in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, a baby girl is born beneath a winter sky. Her name, Vera Jane Palmer. The air smells faintly of coal and new snow. Radios hum with Roosevelt's voice promising renewal to a weary nation. Her parents, Herbert and Vera Palmer, are ordinary people. He a lawyer with tender eyes, she a teacher who loves poetry. They cannot know that their daughter will one day become a symbol of the very glamour and sorrow that define an age. But in this altered strand of history, the story begins with a quiet mercy. Herbert Palmer does not die of a sudden heart attack when Jane is only 3 years old. Instead, he lives, his heart frail but steadfast, his presence anchoring the small family through the uncertain 1930s. Where once in our true timeline there was absence, here there is love. His survival reshapes Jane's soul, her laughter steady and full, not the echo of loss, but the song of assurance. Childhood unfolds like a warm afternoon in this version of her life. The family moves to Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where Jane attends Sunday school and learns to play the violin. Her father reads aloud from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, his voice deep and kind. When she giggles at the cleverness of Viola's disguise, he smiles and tells her, "Remember, my darling, there is strength in pretending, if only you know when to stop." Those words will one day become her private compass. Her mother, practical and proud, nurtures Jane's curiosity. She encourages her to learn German, to read Dickens, to speak her mind. Their household is not rich, but it is abundant in affection. The young girl grows into her talents with confidence rather than craving. Beauty begins to bloom early, but it does not define her yet. She is known in school for her clever answers and dramatic recitations, not her golden curls. Outside, the 1930s drift toward shadow. The world darkens with the distant rumble of war. Hollywood in faraway California shines as a beacon of escapism, a place where dreams can survive even as nations tremble. Jane, sitting cross-legged before the flickering silver of Gone with the Wind, feels something stir deep within her. It is not vanity, not yet. It is the yearning to exist larger, to be felt, remembered, understood. She whispers to her father, "I want to be there someday." He chuckles softly. "Then make sure they remember your mind first." In our known history, Jane lost her father soon after those tender years. That loss, many said, carved the emptiness she later tried to fill with fame. But here, his steady love endures, giving her a sense of belonging that alters her choices. When adolescence arrives, she is still ambitious, but not desperate. Her charm feels grounded, her wit deliberate. The world around her, still reeling from war and change, will one day test the depth of that grounding. By the early 1940s, the family moves again, this time to Dallas, Texas, where opportunity and sunlight feel infinite. The war looms abroad, but Jane finds herself in a classroom reciting Latin phrases, imagining the stage lights of another life. She writes her first letter to the local radio station, offering to read poetry on air. They accept, impressed by the boldness of her request. At 13, she delivers her first public performance, a tremulous reading of Keats' Bright Star. The audience hears not the coquettish lilt of the future bombshell, but the controlled cadence of a girl who already understands rhythm, tone, and the gravity of words. Her father sits in the small audience, his hand on his heart, tears welling not from pride alone, but from foresight. He knows she will not live a small life. When the applause comes, Jayne does not blush. She bows with poise, her voice soft as she thanks them. Afterward, she turns to him and says, "I think I found my light, Daddy." He nods. "Then hold it carefully. The world loves to look at light, but it rarely protects it." This single difference, his living presence, changes the emotional architecture of her destiny. In the real timeline, Jayne's longing for fatherly affection drove her toward the adoration of the public. Here, that hunger is tempered by a sense of enoughness. When she dreams of Hollywood now, it is not as an escape, but as a canvas. The foundation of her ambition becomes art, not approval. As the 1940s fade into the promise of peace, Jayne matures into a young woman whose magnetism blends intellect and innocence. She still turns heads when she walks, but her classmates whisper as much about her essays on Ovid as about her beauty. She begins to understand that both can coexist, that a woman can be beautiful and brilliant without apology. It is a realization ahead of its time, and it will one day make her both misunderstood and unforgettable. In this alternate beginning, her world ends not in tragedy, but in dawn. A father's steady breath, a mother's patience, a young girl's restless wonder, all merge to form a foundation that will carry her through the glimmering, perilous decades to come. And as the radio hums the last notes of Moonlight Serenade, Jayne gazes out her window toward the unseen horizon, where neon dreams and studio gates wait. She does not yet know that she will conquer them, or that in another timeline, she never will. But tonight, the stars outside her window seem unusually close, as if time itself leans forward to listen. By 1950, America is awakening from the darkness of war into a new era of confidence, chrome, and dreams sold in Technicolor. Jayne Mansfield, now a poised and radiant young woman of 17, has grown into a reflection of that post-war optimism. In this gentler version of her life, her father's guidance continues to steady her ambitions, and her mother's quiet intelligence still nourishes her mind. She graduates from Highland Park High School with honors, earning a reputation not only for her beauty, but for her command of languages, German, Spanish, and a touch of French, and her fascination with classical literature. When she speaks, people listen, captivated not just by her face, but by her fluency, her wit, and the spark of something deeper behind her eyes. The America around her is shifting. The suburbs expand like seashells, television hums in living rooms, and a generation of young people begins to believe that anything is possible. Jayne absorbs it all, the optimism, the consumer confidence, the hunger for identity, and carries it like perfume. She marries her high school sweetheart, Paul Mansfield, a sturdy young man with a steady job and an admiration for her boundless spirit. Their early marriage is a portrait of post-war hope. Two young dreamers, a baby on the way, and the wide horizon of America's new decade ahead of them. Yet Jayne's yearning for something beyond the ordinary persists. She studies drama at Southern Methodist University, performing in small campus productions and gaining quiet confidence with each role. She reads Shakespeare in the evenings while cradling her infant daughter, Jane Marie, whispering soliloquies in the dim lamplight as if preparing not for fame, but for fate. Her husband is supportive at first, proud to see her talent bloom, but as she begins to talk of Los Angeles, the studios, the auditions, the endless light of California, he grows uneasy. "We have a good life here," he says one evening. "Why chase something so far away?" She looks at him for a long moment, then replies softly, "Because it's already calling me." By 1953, Jayne persuades him to make the move west. The road to Hollywood is not golden but dusty, a long stretch of highway lined with hope and disappointment. They arrive in a city shimmering with promises and illusions, where every waitress claims to be an actress and every actor waits for a phone call that may never come. Jayne, however, is not just another hopeful. Her intelligence and self-possession set her apart. She enrolls in acting classes at UCLA, studies method acting, and refuses to let herself be molded entirely by studio executives who see only her curves. "I can learn," she insists, "but I will not be taught what to forget." Her early auditions bring rejection and polite amusement. Casting agents tell her she is too much, too voluptuous, too expressive, too smart for the roles available. Yet this very excess becomes her secret weapon. She begins to understand the alchemy of persona, the way one can wear an image like a mask, not to hide but to provoke. Hollywood's golden decade has no shortage of blondes, yet none have her mixture of intellect and vulnerability. Slowly, she begins to carve a niche, appearing in small television roles and minor films, always leaving an impression greater than her screen time. In this timeline, the foundation laid by her father's love and her mother's intellect keeps her from falling into the traps that claim so many others. She turns down demeaning photo shoots, refuses exploitative contracts, and takes evening classes in business law to understand the industry's workings. Her ambition is tempered by foresight, a rare thing in an age when fame often burns faster than it earns. Reporters begin to notice her not merely as a pretty face, but as a thinking woman starlet. In 1954, an article in Photoplay describes her as a surprising blend of glamour and gravity. Jayne clips the article and keeps it in her diary, beside a quotation from Ovid. "Endure and persist. This pain will turn to good by and by." By the mid-1950s, the glitz of Hollywood's studio system is beginning to crack. Television nibbles at film audiences, and new stars, raw, unpredictable, rebellious, are emerging. Jayne senses the shift and shapes her image to match it. She allows herself the playful sensuality that the public craves, but infuses it with irony and intelligence. She studies the public's reaction as if conducting an experiment in sociology. "They look at me," she writes in her journal, "and think they see innocence or foolishness, but perhaps what they really see is themselves, yearning to be adored." Her early roles, though small, carry her into the social circles of Hollywood's rising generation. She meets actors, directors, and producers who see in her not only potential but presence. At a dinner party one evening, a studio executive remarks, "You remind me of Monroe." Jayne smiles faintly. "Perhaps Monroe reminds you of me," she replies, with a wink that softens the sting. The table erupts in laughter, but the remark lingers in memory. It is the first sign of her quiet defiance, a woman unafraid to measure herself against the icons of her time. Her husband, increasingly uncomfortable with the shifting world around them, returns to Texas, unable to reconcile his domestic dreams with her artistic ascent. The parting is sad but inevitable. In this alternate world, however, there is no scandal, no bitterness, only mutual respect and quiet farewell. Jayne remains in California raising her daughter with the help of her parents, who move west to be near her. The small family home in Beverly Hills becomes a haven of warmth and laughter amid the artificial lights of the city. Her father, though older now, still reads to her from Shakespeare on quiet evenings. When she lands her first significant supporting role, he tells her, "Remember, fame is only applause. Legacy is the echo." By 1955, Hollywood finally begins to take notice. She wins a role in Female Jungle and earns praise for her natural ease before the camera. The buzz spreads quickly. Producers, always hunting for the next sensation, see in her a blend of familiarity and novelty. Yet Jayne refuses to become merely a reflection of another's success. She starts to craft her own path, focusing not on imitation but on authorship. Her interviews reveal intelligence, charm, and philosophical musings about femininity and fame. "The camera," she says once on air, "doesn't just capture a face, it captures a hunger. The question is whose hunger it really is, the audience's or mine." That question, fragile and luminous, will follow her through the next decade. For now, she stands on the threshold of her own mythology, poised between authenticity and illusion, intellect and desire. Hollywood's lights beckon, promising both glory and danger. She feels her heart beat with the rhythm of possibility, unaware that the choices she makes in these coming years will not only define her career, but reshape the very archetype of the American starlet. Outside, Los Angeles glows like a restless constellation. The sound of distant jazz spills from open windows. In the cool evening breeze, Jayne pauses beneath the street lamps, her shadow stretching long before her, and whispers to the wind, "I'm ready." And so, the world begins to notice. The year is 1955, and America hums with electricity. Rock and roll pulses through jukeboxes, James Dean's ghost haunts the youth, and cinema teeters between the safety of tradition and the hunger for rebellion. Jayne Mansfield, at 22, stands at the crossroads of those two worlds, too intelligent for typecasting, too luminous for dismissal. Hollywood has finally taken her seriously enough to watch her closely, and the public senses something brewing beneath her playful smile. She is not the ingenue the press imagines her to be. She is a quiet revolutionary wrapped in chiffon and wit, poised to rewrite the rules of her own myth. In this alternate history, Jayne's ascent does not rely on shock or scandal. Her image still glitters, of course. How could it not? But it is shaped with intention. When a studio executive suggests she dumb it down a little for a screen test, she replies with polite amusement, "I can pretend to be foolish if you promise to pretend to believe it." The men laugh, thinking it charm, but the women who overhear her recognize something else, a wink, a message beneath the laughter, a sign that she knows exactly what game she's playing. It is a dangerous balance, appealing to a system designed to consume her while secretly subverting it. But Jayne walks that tightrope with the grace of someone who understands that rebellion can sometimes wear pearls. Her breakthrough comes not from accident, but from choice. Instead of chasing every role offered to her, she studies scripts, asks questions about the directors, and insists on reading entire screenplays rather than excerpts. She befriends writers, philosophers, and photographers, absorbing ideas about identity and image. The intellectuals who once mocked her now find themselves intrigued by the paradox she embodies, the blonde as philosopher, the beauty as strategist. She begins attending salons hosted by the Los Angeles art community, where conversation drifts from Sartre to cinema. There, she learns to articulate what she feels instinctively, that glamour is a language, and she intends to speak it fluently. Her new understanding shapes the public persona she crafts. Jayne does not resist being seen as sensual, but she reframes it. When she poses for photographs, she controls the angle and light, learning how to tell a story through posture alone. She studies how Marilyn Monroe uses vulnerability, how Grace Kelly embodies restraint, and how Marlene Dietrich commands mystery. And from those fragments, she constructs something wholly her own, an image of intelligence masked by mischief. The press, ever hungry for archetypes, labels her the thinking man's bombshell. Jayne finds it both flattering and ironic, knowing that thought and beauty should never have been considered opposites. Her performance in The Girl Can't Help It marks her transformation. On screen, she is radiant, playful, larger than life. But off-screen, she uses the film's success to negotiate better contracts and to push for creative control over her publicity materials. She insists on owning the rights to certain photographs, a move almost unheard of for a female star of her time. When reporters ask about her business acumen, she laughs softly and says, "My mind signs the contracts my face introduces." It is both a joke and a manifesto. Through it all, Jayne maintains a delicate equilibrium between defiance and grace. She still attends charity galas and publicity events, but now with a quiet knowingness, a sense that she is performing not for approval, but for authorship. Even her laughter carries intent. It disarms before it dazzles. Critics begin to notice. One writes in The New Yorker that Jayne Mansfield seems to be in on a secret the rest of Hollywood hasn't quite discovered yet, that the role of the dumb blonde may be the smartest performance of all. Jayne reads the line aloud to her father, who beams with pride. "You see, my darling," he tells her, "it's not rebellion if it's done with respect. It's evolution." Her personal life, too, begins to shift. Mickey Hargitay enters her orbit in 1956, a former Mr. Universe whose old-world charm and quiet strength complement her restless intelligence. In this timeline, their courtship is not a publicity circus, but a slow, genuine connection. They spend long evenings discussing art and philosophy, walking the quiet beaches of Malibu after sunset. Mickey, unlike many men around her, does not fear her brilliance. Instead, he admires it. He calls her "my philosopher in heels." She laughs but knows that he means it. For the first time, Jayne feels what she once thought impossible, that love need not diminish ambition but can deepen it. Together, they begin to plan a different kind of stardom. Jayne decides to form a small production company, focusing on films that blend humor with subtle social commentary. She consults with directors who value her input and even begins writing treatments for potential screenplays. One about a woman who outsmarts her Hollywood handlers, another about the loneliness of fame. None are produced yet, but the intention is clear. She is no longer content to be a muse. She wishes to be a creator. The late 1950s are a time of transformation in America. The country's innocence is cracking beneath the pressure of progress, the Cold War, civil rights struggles, the stirrings of the counterculture. Jayne senses this undercurrent and begins to weave it into her interviews. When asked what she thinks of the new women of America, she responds, "We are learning to shine without burning." The line is quoted widely, becoming something of a motto for young women navigating the contradictions of modern femininity. Yet with rebellion comes risk. Some studios grow wary of her independence. Columnists, unable to comprehend her evolution, try to reduce her once more to caricature. But Jayne, fortified by years of inner discipline, does not falter. When an interviewer sneers, "Do you think you'll ever be taken seriously?" she simply replies, "Only by those who are." It is a small act of defiance, but one that ripples quietly through the culture of Hollywood, where women are often punished for wit sharper than their smiles. By 1958, Jayne stands at the pinnacle of fame, not as a symbol of excess, but as a pioneer of agency. Her success, both financial and artistic, allows her to buy a modest home rather than the ostentatious mansion of her real-life counterpart. There are no pink walls, no heart-shaped pools, just a garden, a piano, and a study filled with books. Visitors are surprised to find her reading Kierkegaard or discussing Freud. "I like to know why people do what they do," she explains, including myself. While it is here, in this tranquil yet vibrant phase of her life, that Jayne begins to understand the paradox of rebellion. True change, she realizes, rarely comes from destruction, but from redirection. She is not burning down the old Hollywood. She is slowly rewriting its script from within. Each smile, each photograph, each film roll becomes a note in her quiet symphony of subversion. The sun sets over Los Angeles, painting the hills in gold. Jayne sits on her porch, listening to the hum of the city that once doubted her, and feels both gratitude and melancholy. She has won a measure of freedom, but freedom, she knows, is never final. It must be lived, renewed, reimagined every day. The gentle rebel closes her journal for the night, leaving one sentence unfinished. Perhaps rebellion is not a roar, but a whisper that refuses to fade. By 1959, the shimmer of the old studio era begins to dim, and the world grows restless for something more genuine, more questioning. Jayne Mansfield, no longer the ingenue or the novelty, senses this shift like a subtle change in the wind. The laughter that once surrounded her now comes with pauses of reflection. The eyes that once stared begin to see. The blonde bombshell, once the embodiment of playful excess, is evolving before the public's eyes into something the industry had not prepared for. A woman who refuses to be an idea, who insists on being a mind. In smoky Hollywood cafes and university halls, her name begins to surface in conversations not about scandal, but about substance. The shift is quiet but unmistakable. In this alternate world, Jayne's survival and patience begin to yield fruit. With Mickey Hargitay's constant encouragement and her father's wisdom still echoing in her heart, she establishes Mansfield Productions, a small independent company devoted to creating films about the human condition, light in tone, yes, but laced with intellect. Her first project, Reflections in Neon, is a modest success. It tells the story of a nightclub singer who loses her fame but finds her voice in anonymity. Critics call it unexpectedly contemplative, praising its warmth and restraint. Jayne doesn't appear in the film at all, choosing instead to produce and co-write it, a decision that surprises many who assumed she could only exist before a camera. When asked why she stayed behind the scenes, she replies, "Sometimes you see more when you stop trying to be seen." Her transformation becomes a fascination for journalists. Life magazine publishes a feature titled The Many Faces of Jayne Mansfield, portraying her surrounded not by poodles or photographers, but by books and letters from philosophers, writers, and university students who thank her for inspiring them. Her interviews become thoughtful reflections on fame, femininity, and identity. When asked about the burden of beauty, she says, "It's not a burden when you understand it's only a language. Beauty is the first line of the poem. It's not the poem itself." The quote spreads quickly, appearing in college newspapers, quoted by young women who see in her not a fantasy, but a kindred spirit. Meanwhile, her teaching instinct deepens. Jayne begins giving occasional lectures at UCLA, where she is invited to speak about media and gender. The students, expecting glamour, find gravity. She speaks of her early days, how she learned to smile while being underestimated, how she realized that laughter could be a form of armor. Her voice, soft and melodic, carries not bitterness, but empathy. "The world," she tells them, "loves to label women. But remember, every label is smaller than the person it describes." The room grows still, and when she finishes, there is a quiet, reverent applause. A few young women approach her after class in tears, not from sadness, but from recognition. Hollywood, of course, remains wary. A woman with intellect and influence can be both admired and feared. Yet Jayne's graciousness protects her from backlash. She continues to act in selected films, but each role seems chosen to express another shade of her soul. In A Woman Without Mirrors, she plays a writer struggling to separate her real self from her public persona. The film, though not a box office hit, becomes a cult favorite among artists and thinkers. Reviewers call it a meditation on visibility. Jayne reads those words and smiles quietly, recognizing that at last people are beginning to understand what she has been trying to say all along. Her fame begins to change shape. Where once it was blinding, now it glows like the soft radiance of a candle in an evening room. The parties become fewer, the conversations deeper. Mickey stands beside her at premieres, proud and protective, though often content to remain in the background. He understands that her journey is not away from him, but toward herself. In interviews, she still charms and amuses, but now her humor has the texture of experience. She no longer flirts with the camera, she converses with it. In Europe, where cinema takes on a more philosophical edge, Jayne finds unexpected reverence. Italian directors invite her to participate in experimental projects, and French critics compare her self-awareness to that of Simone Signoret. She travels to Paris to attend a symposium on women in film, sitting on stage beside Anna Magnani and Jean Moreau. When asked whether she feels trapped by her image, Jayne answers simply, "No, I've learned to let it walk beside me instead of in front of me." The audience erupts in applause. For a moment, the woman once dismissed as a caricature becomes a symbol of evolution, proof that even icons can grow beyond their outlines. Her voice begins to enter social conversation as well. The early rumblings of the women's movement find in Jayne a surprising ally. She does not shout slogans or march with banners, but she lends her words, her presence, her grace. In interviews, she speaks of the quiet battles women fight daily for respect, for agency, for the right to be complex. I was never fighting men, she explains. I was fighting the idea that a woman must choose between love and freedom. Why not both? Such statements ripple through the press, drawing admiration from writers like Gloria Steinem, who later invites Jayne to a discussion panel in New York. There, under the soft light of a small stage, Jayne shares stories not of red carpets, but of rejection, reinvention, and resilience. Her humor disarms, her honesty heals. Back home, Hollywood begins to adapt. The younger generation of actresses, Natalie Wood, Shirley MacLaine, and a rising Jane Fonda, look to Jayne as proof that reinvention is possible. Some write to her, thanking her for showing that intelligence and sensuality need not be enemies. She keeps their letters in a small wooden box, each one a fragment of the legacy she is quietly building. She has not abandoned glamour. She has simply infused it with meaning. By the early 1960s, Jayne stands as both a survivor and a teacher of fame. The parties that once sought her for spectacle now invite her for conversation. Her home becomes a gathering place for artists, writers, and philosophers, an oasis of calm thought in a city addicted to noise. Her father, older now but still alert, visits often. On one of those visits, he tells her, "You have become what your mother and I hoped, a woman at peace with her own light." Jayne takes his hand and replies, "I'm learning that the brighter it burns, the more gently it must be held." Outside, the century is changing. The idealism of the 50s gives way to the turbulence of the 60s. Youth begins to question everything, authority, morality, even fame itself. And Jayne, standing at the threshold of this new era, feels ready. She has transformed herself from symbol to soul, from spectacle to speaker. The world that once gazed at her now listens. As night settles over Los Angeles, she steps onto her balcony and looks out at the city lights, each one a dream, a story, a heartbeat. Somewhere in that vast expanse, her younger self still lingers, smiling into the promise of tomorrow. Jayne closes her eyes and whispers, "I kept my light. I didn't let them take it." And as the cool wind moves through the palms, she feels a calm she has never known before. The gentle rebel of yesterday has become the philosopher of today, her radiance no longer borrowed from fame, but born of wisdom. The early 1960s drift in with their soft pastels and their hidden storms. The world is changing, trembling quietly beneath its own elegance, and Jayne Mansfield, now entering her 30s, stands as one of its curious symbols, no longer the luminous girl in a tight dress, but a woman who has outlived her myth. Her fame remains, though it no longer dazzles with the same heat. It glows more like the soft afterlight of a long summer evening, full of warmth and melancholy. She still draws attention wherever she goes, yet the noise around her has softened into something almost reverent. Her public no longer asks, "Who is she?" but "What has she become?" Her marriage to Mickey Hargitay, once the stuff of magazine dreams, has matured into something that confounds Hollywood's expectations. Where others predicted collapse, they find endurance. There are disagreements, of course. Two vivid personalities seldom move in perfect harmony, but they share an understanding of the fragility behind fame. Mickey, with his quiet steadiness, becomes her anchor in moments when the glare of public life feels blinding. Together they raise their children in a house filled with laughter and music, a home that is neither extravagant nor austere, but alive with the pulse of ordinary love. In this world, Jayne's choices have been tempered by wisdom. She no longer feeds the tabloids with spectacle, no longer courts attention for its own sake. She begins to live in rhythms that are human rather than cinematic. There are still film roles, Lighter comedies, thoughtful dramas, and a few of them surprise the critics with her growing subtlety. She acts not to be adored, but to express, not to prove her beauty, but to preserve her truth. In interviews, her speech has grown slower, her thoughts more deliberate. When asked how marriage and motherhood have changed her, she smiles and says, "They made me less afraid of silence." That remark lingers in the air, quoted in columns, debated in drawing rooms, admired by women who recognize in her calm an evolution of courage. Hollywood, though, remains a place of constant hunger. Younger faces emerge, brighter and fresher, unmarked by the past. The city that once built her legend now courts a new generation of dreamers. Yet Jayne does not resent them. She watches them kindly, seeing in their anxious laughter the reflection of her own early days. She begins to mentor a few young actresses, advising them not on how to pose or flirt, but how to breathe, how to think, how to endure. Beauty fades, she tells them one afternoon, but dignity has a longer half-life. They listen, half in awe, half in disbelief, sensing the weight of experience behind her gentleness. It is around this time that Jayne begins writing more earnestly. What started as scattered journal entries becomes a manuscript, a meditation on fame, femininity, and survival. She writes by the window in the early mornings, her pen moving with unhurried grace. The book is not a memoir, but a series of reflections, titled The Art of Becoming Seen. In it, she explores the paradox of visibility, how fame both reveals and erases, how being looked at can make one invisible in other ways. We think the world watches us, she writes in one chapter, but it is we who are watching the world watch, trying to understand what it wants to see. The manuscript circulates quietly among publishers, some hesitant, others enthralled. A small New York press finally accepts it, drawn to its honesty and lyricism. When it appears in 1963, it is neither a bestseller nor a scandal. It is, instead, a whisper that endures. Writers, artists, and students quote from it for years to come. As the 60s unfold, the social air thickens with change. The civil rights movement marches forward, the youth grow restless, and a nation once content with its certainties begins to question everything. Jayne feels this transformation deeply. Her curiosity draws her to the voices of the new generation, the poets, the protesters, the dreamers of equality. She begins speaking publicly about the dignity of all people, and though her tone is always measured, her sincerity cannot be mistaken. At charity events, she refuses to separate glamour from conscience. "A gown," she remarks to a reporter, "does not make a woman blind to justice." Such statements delivered with grace carry power. She is invited to participate in panels and discussions, sometimes alongside intellectuals who once dismissed her. Time has softened the skepticism, replacing it with genuine respect. At home, her family flourishes, though not without strain. Fame is a tide that never fully recedes, and privacy is an art learned slowly. There are moments when the press intrudes, when gossip revives old ghosts, but Jayne handles these with the patience of someone who no longer fears misunderstanding. Her children grow up knowing her not as a fantasy, but as a mother who cooks, reads aloud, and listens. Mickey, still devoted, continues his work as a fitness entrepreneur, while Jayne begins to see her future in teaching, writing, and smaller but more meaningful creative projects. They are not a fairy tale couple, but they are something rarer in their world, real. And yet, beneath her serenity, a subtle melancholy lingers. In quiet moments, Jayne sometimes looks back and wonders what she might have been had she not been beautiful. It is not regret exactly, but contemplation, a curiosity about how much of her life has been shaped by other people's gazes. In her diary, she writes, "I have been adored, and I have been understood. The second is rarer." But she does not dwell on sorrow, she meets it with gratitude. The tragedies that haunted her real history, the relentless pressures, the fatal exhaustion, find no place here. Instead, there is endurance, a graceful aging that feels almost revolutionary in a city devoted to youth. Her father, now elderly, still visits when he can. They sit in the garden together in the evenings, the scent of jasmine in the air, speaking little, but sharing much. He tells her how proud he is that she has become more than he ever imagined, and she tells him that his survival was her true beginning. "If you had gone," she says softly, "I might have chased the wrong kind of love forever." He takes her hand, his eyes glistening. "And now?" he asks. "Now," she replies, "I chase meaning instead." By the mid-1960s, Jayne's reputation has transformed. The critics who once sneered now describe her as one of the most self-aware women of her generation. Her public appearances are measured, her interviews philosophical, her screen work selective. She's invited to Europe again, not as a curiosity but as a collaborator, starring in a British drama about a woman reclaiming her past. The performance earns her the first major acting award of her career, not the Oscar she once dreamed of, but something gentler, and to her, more authentic: respect. Fame, like love, evolves. The heart that once raced with ambition now beats with a quiet rhythm of acceptance. Jayne has learned that every spotlight casts shadows, but she no longer fears them. She walks within them, unafraid. The fragility that once defined her has become her grace. She understands, at last, that true fame is not how brightly one shines, but how deeply one's light lingers after it fades. One evening, after a small premiere, she stands outside the theater, the night air cool against her skin. Reporters call her name, cameras flash, but she feels no rush, no need to perform. She looks toward the sky instead, where the city's glow meets the quiet of the stars, and she smiles, a smile not for the world, but for herself. The applause behind her fades, the future before her beckons softly. Jayne Mansfield, the girl who once embodied Hollywood's golden illusion, has become its most human truth. The decade turns, and with it, the soul of America begins to tremble. The early 60s had promised renewal, but by their middle years, the air has grown restless with contradiction. Youth and war, protest and dream, beauty and grief. Jayne Mansfield, now in her early 30s, stands quietly at the edge of this transformation. Once a creature of Hollywood's fantasy, she has become something rarer and more enduring, a voice of reflection in a time of noise. The brightness that once surrounded her has softened, but in its gentler hue she glows more deeply, her fame ripened into a kind of wisdom. She has outlived the illusions that made her, and in doing so, she finds a peace the world around her seems to be losing. Her days are now divided between her family, her writing, and a growing curiosity about the changes sweeping across the nation. The civil rights marches, the student uprisings, the music that drifts from coffee houses. She feels all of it, a pulse of awakening that mirrors her own. She no longer chases the stage or the camera. She chooses them only when the message feels necessary. She begins collaborating with independent filmmakers who seek not glamour, but honesty, lending her name and grace to small projects about human dignity and freedom. One such film, a quiet black and white drama titled The Voice Inside, tells the story of a woman who learns to find meaning in simplicity after fame's collapse. It earns critical praise, not for spectacle, but for truth. Jayne, though reluctant to speak of her performance, later admits to a friend that the role was the closest she had ever come to playing herself. In public, she remains a figure of fascination. Journalists cannot decide what to make of her, too poised to be scandalous, too sincere to be mocked. When one reporter asks if she misses her golden years, she smiles gently and answers, "No, I'm finally living them." The remark circulates widely, quoted in magazines and discussed on television talk shows. But behind that quiet answer lies a long journey toward acceptance, the recognition that the world does not owe her attention, and that her worth no longer depends on being adored. Fame, she has come to understand, is not a mirror to be gazed into forever, but a window through which one must eventually step. Then, one warm night in 1967, destiny arrives again, but differently. On the Louisiana highway where history once took her life, the accident still happens. The night still holds its breath. The car still twists through the dark. Yet in this telling, she does not die. The crash leaves her gravely injured, scarred, and shaken, but alive. When she wakes in the hospital, her body aches with a pain that feels both physical and symbolic, the cost of survival. She gazes at her reflection, the marks upon her skin, and feels something shift deep within her. Not sorrow, but clarity. For the first time, she feels utterly separate from the idea of Jayne Mansfield that the world had worshipped. The illusion has been stripped away, and what remains is simply a woman, still breathing, still thinking, still capable of love. Her recovery is slow, measured in months rather than days. Mickey never leaves her side, and her children take turns bringing her small gifts. A drawing, a seashell, a melody hummed at her bedside. The hospital room becomes her sanctuary, a small world where fame cannot enter. Letters pour in from across the country, from fans and strangers alike, and she reads them quietly, touched by their tenderness. In the long silences of recovery, she begins to write again, not with the polish of her earlier essays, but with a raw honesty born of suffering. In one letter, she writes, "Perhaps fame was never meant to be forever, but truth might be." It is a line she will return to again and again until it becomes almost a prayer. When she finally returns home, her pace is slower, her walk measured, but her presence somehow greater. The world looks at her scars with a mix of pity and fascination, but Jayne wears them without shame. She tells an interviewer, "I used to live for applause, now I live for mornings." The simplicity of that statement captures a generation's exhaustion with glamour and its yearning for authenticity. Overnight, she becomes something unexpected, a symbol of rebirth, of resilience, of survival in an age of destruction. The late 60s suit her better than anyone could have imagined. The world that once adored perfection now admires imperfection. The counterculture embraces rawness, sincerity, rebellion against false ideals. Jayne, without planning to, has become part of that movement. She is invited to speak at universities, to share her thoughts on image and self-worth. Standing before rooms filled with young men and women who've never known the innocence of the 50s, she speaks softly of the dangers of fame, of the importance of individuality. Every generation, she tells them, must learn how to see itself clearly before it begins to believe its own reflection. Her words strike a chord. Students write to her afterward, thanking her not for glamour, but for guidance. Her public appearances become rarer, but each one matters. She appears on television not as a celebrity, but as a guest thinker, discussing the philosophy of self-perception, the interplay between art and reality. Viewers, expecting nostalgia, instead find themselves disarmed by her insight. The woman who once embodied fantasy now speaks like a sage. Even the late-night hosts, usually eager for jokes, grow still when she reflects on the cost of being seen too brightly. The camera, she says, is a beautiful liar. It shows what light touches, but never what shadows teach. The line lingers long after she leaves the studio, replayed in retrospectives for decades to come. Mickey, steadfast and humble, remains her constant presence. They spend quiet evenings listening to records, watching their children grow, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes, in the softness of dusk, Jayne confides in him her fears, that her survival has made her a ghost of her former self. He takes her hand and says, "No, my love, you've just become real." It is in those words that she finds her peace. For the first time in her life, she no longer measures herself against what she was. She begins to live wholly in what she is. In 1969, she publishes a small book of essays and letters titled Light After Glamour. It sells modestly but becomes a quiet phenomenon among those who seek meaning in the ruins of the 20th century's illusions. In its pages, she writes not of fame, but of forgiveness. Of forgiving herself for the masks she once wore, of forgiving the world for asking her to wear them. One line captures her readers most. We are all born shining, but only a few of us survive our own reflection. The book cements her place not just in Hollywood's memory, but in cultural consciousness as a thinker, a survivor, and an artist of the self. The world moves on. Moon landings, assassinations, the rise of new idols, but Jayne remains quietly luminous, a living reminder of a vanished age and of the courage it took to outlive it. In her garden in Los Angeles, surrounded by jasmine and her children's laughter, she sits with a cup of tea and watches the sunset. The light catches her hair, no longer platinum but silver gold, and she smiles at its softness. The city hums below, restless as ever, but she feels none of its urgency. Once, she murmurs, I thought I had to chase the light. Now I know it will always find me. The wind stirs gently through the palm trees, carrying with it the echo of her younger self, a girl from Pennsylvania who once dreamed of being seen. Now, in the calm twilight of her middle years, Jayne Mansfield finally understands that the truest form of being seen is to be understood. The golden age may be fading, but a new light has risen in its place, quiet, enduring, and free. The 70s arrive not with trumpets, but with a sigh, as if the world itself is weary from too much revolution, too many farewells. America is learning to breathe again after its fevered decade, and Jayne Mansfield, now a woman in her late 30s, moves through this new time with the serenity of one who has already lived several lives. The glamour of the old Hollywood has dissolved into nostalgia, replaced by a harsher, more introspective art. Films about disillusionment, protest songs, the hunger for truth. Jayne belongs to neither the past nor the present entirely. She drifts between them, carrying the aura of memory and the weight of survival. Her fame no longer shouts. It hums softly in the background like a familiar tune, rediscovered after years of silence. In this world that celebrates realism over perfection, Jayne's voice begins to find its true resonance. She turns inward, choosing reflection over performance, depth over dazzle. The scars from her accident, once symbols of tragedy, have faded into gentle traces on her skin, but they remain sacred to her. They remind her each morning as she looks in the mirror that she is still here, that she has lived beyond the script written for her. That quiet miracle shapes everything she does. She begins to write more earnestly, filling notebook after notebook with thoughts about perception, womanhood, and mortality. Some pages become essays, others remain private prayers. Her writing is calm but unflinching, free from vanity, full of the slow tenderness of someone who has made peace with imperfection. Television producers, sensing the cultural shift toward authenticity, invite her to appear on talk shows not as the blonde bombshell of yesterday, but as a speaker, a commentator on fame and selfhood. She accepts cautiously, aware of the irony, how the same medium that once reduced her to an image now seeks to hear her voice. On air, she sits with poise, her tone low and deliberate, her gaze steady. When asked about the changing role of women in America, she answers with quiet conviction. It isn't that we've changed, it's that the world has finally learned to listen. The audience grows silent, struck by the clarity of her words. No longer a subject of curiosity, she has become a vessel for understanding. The applause that follows is not adoration, but respect, and that to her feels more beautiful than anything she has ever known. In 1971, she is invited to write a regular column for a cultural magazine. She names it The Quiet Lens, and in each installment she explores the illusions of visibility, the way fame magnifies some parts of a person while erasing others. Her essays are neither bitter nor nostalgic. They are meditations on balance, kindness, and the long journey from being seen to being known. The columns gather a loyal following, and soon universities begin inviting her to speak. Jayne, once photographed for her figure, now stands behind lecterns, her voice calm and precise, discussing the evolution of female representation in film. Students listen in rapt attention, struck by the dignity of a woman they had grown up hearing about only in whispers of scandal and beauty. She does not lecture, she converses. Her words move like water, soft, persistent, reshaping the landscape beneath them. The shift is profound. For the first time in her life, Jayne feels that her mind and body exist in harmony, that she is no longer divided between what she knows and what she appears to be. Her old friends in Hollywood visit occasionally, startled by the gentleness of her new life. The pink dresses and flashing bulbs are gone, replaced by linen skirts and stacks of books. She entertains small gatherings at her home, where laughter drifts through the rooms like candlelight. When asked whether she misses the glitter of her earlier years, she smiles faintly. "I don't miss the light," she says. "I miss the innocence of believing it would last forever." Then, after a pause, she adds, "But I think I'm happier, knowing it doesn't." Her children, growing quickly, see her not as a relic of fame, but as a living example of reinvention. Her daughter Mariska, curious and kind, often watches her mother write in the evenings, asking questions about the strange mixture of beauty and sorrow that shaped her. Jayne answers with candor, never hiding her mistakes or disguising her lessons. "I wanted to be loved by everyone," she tells her one night, "but the real miracle is to love yourself once the world moves on." Mariska listens, wide-eyed, not yet realizing that one day she too will carry her mother's legacy into the world. In these years, Jayne begins to travel again, this time not for premieres or photo calls, but for quiet engagements at universities and art festivals. She visits London, where she is greeted by scholars who once studied her films as case studies in cultural evolution. In Rome, she meets with aging filmmakers who remember her early visits in the 50s and marvel at how she has transformed. In Berlin, she delivers a lecture on the archetype of the blonde in Western art, tracing the image from Botticelli to Monroe, concluding softly, "Every ideal of beauty is a mirror, and every mirror is a story about longing." The audience rises to their feet, not for the celebrity before them, but for the philosopher she has become. Yet beneath all this serenity, there remains a quiet ache, a nostalgia not for youth, but for the pure, reckless hunger of it. Sometimes, when she walks past a theater showing one of her old films, she pauses outside, listening to the faint laughter spilling into the street. She wonders who that woman on screen really was, if she still lives somewhere deep within her. But instead of sadness, she feels gratitude, as though that version of herself had carried her far enough to reach this gentler shore. "We are many selves," she writes later, "and each deserves to be forgiven." In 1974, a television network produces a retrospective about Hollywood's golden age, and Jayne agrees to appear as a narrator. Her voice, low, graceful, tinged with time, guides the audience through clips of an era now gone. She speaks not with pride, but with tenderness for all those who didn't live to see the years that followed. When her own image flickers briefly across the screen, a flash of pink satin, a playful smile, she pauses in her narration and says, "She was lovely, wasn't she? I hope she found what she was looking for." The line, unscripted, becomes one of the most quoted moments of the broadcast. Viewers weep, critics call it haunting, and younger audiences discover her anew, not as a relic of glamour, but as a witness to time's gentleness. By the middle of the decade, Jayne has become a figure of rare calm in a world still chasing noise. She retreats to Palm Springs, where she writes, gardens, and teaches occasional seminars on media and identity. Her home is filled with books, soft music, and the scent of orange blossoms. Visitors describe her as luminous, not because of her beauty, but because of her stillness. She spends long evenings watching the desert light fade into indigo, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. In those moments, she feels both small and infinite, a woman who has learned to outlast her reflection. When journalists come to interview her, they often expect analysis. What they find is grace. One evening, a young reporter, nervous and earnest, asks her what she believes is the secret to happiness. Jayne looks thoughtful for a long time, then says quietly, "To be seen for the first time when the world has stopped looking." The reporter writes down the words slowly, as if afraid to disturb them. In the stillness of those later years, Jayne's voice, once drowned in laughter and camera flashes, has finally become clear. It is the voice of a woman who has walked through illusion into understanding, who has lost everything that was temporary and found everything that was true. The girl who once chased light now becomes its keeper. And though she does not know it yet, her journey is only halfway done. For the decades ahead will turn her calm into legacy. By 1976, the world feels older. The glitter of post-war promise has faded into something quieter, more skeptical. The news is full of resignation, political scandal, inflation, the exhaustion of an empire questioning its own reflection. Yet amid this twilight of certainty, Jayne Mansfield glows with the soft resilience of a survivor who has made peace with her shadows. The public that once watched her every gesture now watches her evolution with awe. She is no longer the embodiment of desire, nor the warning of excess. She has become, instead, a scholar of her own myth, a living dialogue between what she was and what she chose to become. Her years of reflection have ripened into purpose. She begins lecturing regularly at UCLA, her classes drawing students from film, philosophy, and literature alike. The sight of her at the podium surprises those who first enter expecting spectacle. Instead, they encounter a woman composed and radiant in her simplicity, her voice measured, her words threaded with a kind of seasoned mercy. She teaches not as one who claims to know, but as one who has survived knowing too much. The image, she tells her students, is a cage with velvet bars. You can sing beautifully inside it, but you must know it's still a cage. Her lectures blend theory and memory, weaving together anecdotes of old Hollywood with reflections on Plato's cave, on Freud's dream work, on the masks of archetype. Her students write down every word not just for their exams, but because they sense they are hearing something that transcends academia, a living philosophy of endurance. In her home, shelves once filled with scripts are now lined with books. Simone de Beauvoir beside Jung, Virginia Woolf beside T.S. Eliot. She has become, in her quiet way, a public intellectual. Newspapers profile her not as a fading star, but as a thinker who illuminates the psychology of fame. When asked if she misses her old life, she smiles and replies, "You cannot miss what never truly belonged to you." It is a sentence that echoes far beyond the article, quoted in classrooms and editorials as a kind of epigram for the disillusioned age. Her friendship with Gloria Steinem begins almost by accident, an introduction through a mutual friend at a conference in New York. They spend an afternoon talking about women, art, and the invisible price of visibility. Gloria listens intently to Jayne's insights, surprised by their precision, by how deeply she understands the politics of image. Jayne, in turn, finds in Gloria a kindred soul, someone who speaks aloud what she had felt silently for years. They exchange letters for months afterward, discussing the power of reinvention and the danger of nostalgia. In one letter, Jayne writes, "I used to think liberation meant proving I was more than what they saw. Now I think it's simply living without needing to prove anything at all." Gloria publishes that line years later in an anthology on women's voices, crediting Jayne as the philosopher who once wore a crown of light and learned to live without it. Hollywood by now has almost forgotten how to handle her. The industry has moved on to grittier realism, to stars who do not smile so easily. Yet directors of substance, those who remember her with respect, begin to offer her smaller, richer roles. the weary matron, the wise neighbor, the teacher who has seen too much. Jayne chooses carefully, acting not for income but for conversation. Each role becomes an echo of her inner life, a meditation on time and transformation. Her performance in a 1977 independent film, The Quiet Season, earns her a nomination at the Venice Film Festival. The film is spare and haunting, centered on a woman who revisits her youth through the eyes of her grown daughter. Critics describe Jayne's portrayal as a study in silence. For her, it is more than that. It is closure, a reconciliation with every version of herself that fame had fractured. Her children, now growing into young adulthood, look upon her with a mixture of awe and protectiveness. Mariska, in particular, inherits her mother's curiosity about people and emotion. They spend long evenings together watching the desert sky darken, talking about love, resilience, and the smallness of fear. "You don't have to fight the world," Jayne tells her softly one night. "Just keep showing it who you are until it learns to see you." Those words become a quiet inheritance, shaping the daughter's path in ways neither can yet imagine. As Jayne's academic work deepens, so too does her public influence. She becomes a sought-after speaker on the ethics of media and the psychology of fame. Her essays are published in respected journals, often exploring the intersection of philosophy and performance. One, titled The Spectator's Mirror, becomes a cornerstone in emerging film theory courses, examining how audiences project their desires onto those who perform them. Scholars praise its nuance. Readers find it heartbreakingly human. Her tone is never accusatory. It is reflective, compassionate, and always aware of the frailty shared between watcher and watched. "We are all mirrors," she writes in the closing line. "What we reflect depends on how much light we allow ourselves to see." In private, Jayne continues her lifelong ritual of writing letters she never sends, to lost friends, to old loves, to the girl she once was. In one such letter, she writes, "Dear Jayne, I forgive you for wanting too much. You were not greedy. You were just afraid the world would stop looking before it understood." The letter ends with a single line. "It did stop looking, but you kept living." She folds it neatly and places it in her drawer beside a photograph of herself at 23, smiling in black and white. The face seems distant, but not foreign. She touches the photo lightly and whispers, "Thank you for getting me this far." The 70s drift toward their end, carrying with them the last embers of the century's golden illusions. Jayne, now in her mid-40s, feels the passage of time not as loss, but as revelation. Her body slows, her steps deliberate, but her mind sharpens. Her beauty has softened into a kind of serenity, her presence commanding without effort. She lives neither as a recluse nor as a public figure, but as something in between, a keeper of stories, a translator between worlds. Former students visit her often, seeking counsel not about fame or art, but about life itself. She tells them the same thing each time: learn to outgrow the image before it outgrows you. In the final months of the decade, she publishes another book, Still Light, Essays on Fame and Forgiveness. It receives modest but meaningful acclaim. The reviews describe it as a collection of reflections from a woman who has seen the dream dissolve and still believes in its beauty. The final essay, titled The Art of Remaining, ends with a single sentence that becomes her epitaph long before her death. "Survival is not the absence of loss. It is the tenderness that grows in its shadow." By 1979, the world has changed again. Disco fades, politics sour, and the public turns its attention elsewhere. Yet Jayne Mansfield, now living quietly in her desert home, remains at peace. In her solitude, she feels no need to reclaim her former radiance, for she has discovered a different kind of light, one that glows inwardly, steady and unafraid. Each dawn finds her writing by the window, a cup of tea cooling beside her, the sunlight painting her pages gold. The woman who once embodied glamour now embodies grace. and somewhere in the quiet hum of morning, she knows that the myth has ended, but the soul has endured. The year is 1979, and Los Angeles is a city changing its skin. The neon dazzle of the 70s is beginning to dim, replaced by a mood of reflection, nostalgia, and artistic searching. Film, once the empire of spectacle, has turned inward. Directors now look for stories of truth, aging, and consequence. It is in this moment that Jayne Mansfield, now 46 and long since freed from the grasp of her own myth, feels a familiar stirring within her. She has taught, written, lectured, and loved her way into a quiet kind of wisdom, but the stage, the camera's strange intimacy, still whispers to her. Not as a demand for attention, but as an invitation to speak once more, in a new voice, through a new form of honesty. She does not plan her return. It begins almost by accident when a young director named Robert Hanley, a former student of hers from UCLA, comes to visit her home one afternoon. He brings with him a script, small, unglamorous, tender. The film, titled Autumn Grace, is about a woman who once dreamed of fame but now lives quietly, tending her garden and the remnants of her youth. Jayne reads it by the evening light, the pages turning slowly in her hands. The character feels familiar, but not in a way that stings. It feels like recognition, like looking in a mirror and smiling at the person who finally looks back. When she finishes, she looks up and says simply, "Yes, I know her." Filming begins in the quiet outskirts of Los Angeles. There are no caravans, no paparazzi, no grand publicity. Jayne arrives on set in her linen clothes, her face free of heavy makeup, her hair streaked naturally with silver. The crew, many of them too young to remember her golden years, watch in silence as she steps before the camera. The first scene requires her to walk through a field at dusk, holding a single flower, and pause to listen to a faint melody on the wind. When the camera rolls, the entire set falls still. The director later recalls that her movement seemed almost sacred, as though she was not performing but remembering. The film's cinematographer, moved by the moment, whispers to him, "She's not acting, she's forgiving." When Autumn Grace premieres in the spring of 1980, it receives modest release but extraordinary praise. Critics who once dismissed her as a relic now write of her as a revelation. One review reads, "Jayne Mansfield has done what no one thought possible. She has aged into truth. Her face carries the history of illusion, and her eyes carry its redemption." The film does not win major awards, but its quiet success spreads by word of mouth. Audiences, especially women of her generation, see in her performance their own reconciliation with time. Letters flood in from across the country, thank yous, confessions, memories. Jayne reads them all, some with tears, some with laughter, and feels an unfamiliar sense of wholeness. The applause that once chased her has finally caught up, not for beauty, not for myth, but for being. Encouraged by the film's reception, Jayne continues acting through the early 80s, choosing roles with the same deliberate care she brings to her teaching. She works with independent directors, European artists, and young visionaries who seek not fame, but meaning. In one film, she plays an aging painter confronting her mortality. In another, a mother mourning the loss of her son to war. Each character in some way mirrors her journey from image to soul. Her performances are stripped of artifice, her gestures slow, her expressions raw, her silences profound. One critic writes that, "Mansfield now acts with her breathing," and Jayne treasures the phrase. It feels accurate. She has learned that the most powerful expressions are those that arrive like a sigh after long restraint. The entertainment world, unpredictable as ever, begins to rediscover her. Invitations arrive, television retrospectives, film festivals, even late-night interviews, but she accepts only those that honor her work without reducing her to nostalgia. On one such program, the host asks her what it feels like to be rediscovered after all these years. Jayne laughs softly and replies, "I don't think I was lost. I think everyone else just had to catch up." The audience laughs, but there is reverence beneath their laughter. The woman who once embodied Hollywood's glitter now embodies its grace. She sits on stage, elegant in a dark dress, and speaks about the passage of time as though it were a dear friend rather than an enemy. Aging, she says, is not the fading of light, it's the turning of the day. Her newfound acclaim attracts attention from a younger generation of actresses. Some write to her seeking guidance, others visit her in person. Jayne welcomes them all, offering tea and stories, speaking candidly about the traps of fame. She tells them to guard their solitude, to choose truth over perfection, and to remember that applause can never fill the silence of one's own heart. The secret, she tells one rising star, is not to survive fame, it's to survive yourself in the middle of it. These words, passed along quietly among those who meet her, begin to shape a new kind of legacy, one not of glamour but of mentorship, one that redefines what it means to endure in a world that worships transience. The 80s are not without melancholy. Hollywood, transformed by blockbuster spectacle, once again becomes loud, restless, and impatient. Yet Jayne's calm only deepens. She continues to write, occasionally publishing essays on the shifting nature of fame and the erosion of sincerity in modern culture. Her words, clear and compassionate, resonate with readers who feel alienated by the speed of the age. One essay, The Slow Art of Being, becomes her most beloved work. To exist beautifully, she writes, is not to dazzle or to disappear, but to dwell in one's own rhythm. The world will always look away too soon, so live long enough to meet its gaze again. Her children thrive, each in their own way. Mariska, now a young woman, begins acting, guided quietly by her mother's example. Jayne watches her daughter's early performances with both pride and a touch of fear, knowing too well the tenderness of such a path. Yet when she sees the depth in Mariska's eyes, she recognizes the inheritance she has passed on. Not beauty, but truth. "You are everything I tried to become," she tells her one night. "Only you started from the part I had to learn last." Mariska smiles and takes her mother's hand. There are no tears, only the shared understanding of two women who have both learned to live in the light and the shadow. As the decade moves forward, Jayne's image, once flattened by gossip and myth, begins to take its rightful place in history. Film historians write of her as the actress who lived beyond the frame, a woman who transcended the boundaries of her own creation. Retrospectives celebrate not her scandal, but her survival, not her glamour, but her grace. She accepts each tribute humbly, often saying, "I was never meant to be remembered for how I looked, but for how I changed when I was seen." The irony of those words is not lost on anyone who hears them. By 1986, Jayne is 60, though she carries the years with the serenity of someone who has already made peace with them. She still acts occasionally, teaches when invited, and writes daily. Her mornings are slow and filled with the small rituals that now define her joy. Fresh coffee, soft piano music, letters from former students scattered across the table. In the evenings, she sits by the window and watches the horizon fade into the warm haze of the Pacific. She feels, at last, the fullness of her life, not as a story of reinvention, but as a return. She began as a dreamer, became a myth, and finally, after surviving both, became herself. One night, she attends a small film festival in Santa Barbara, where Autumn Grace is being screened for a new generation of students. As the final scene plays, her figure walking through the fading light, the audience grows still. When the lights rise, Jayne stands to thank them. She does not give a speech. She only says, "The light has changed since then, but it still feels like home." And in that moment, surrounded by the applause of people who finally understand her, Jayne Mansfield smiles, not as a star reborn, but as a woman who has outlived the need for any crown at all. By the late 1980s, the pace of Jayne Mansfield's life has slowed to something resembling the rhythm of a long exhale. The world outside has changed beyond recognition. MTV flickers through a restless youth culture, Reagan's America hums with wealth and unease, and Hollywood's dreams have turned digital, faster and louder than before. But in a modest house surrounded by bougainvillea and the hum of the California wind, Jayne lives a life that feels untouched by time. The chaos of fame, the glitter of youth, the pain of reinvention, all of it has settled into the quiet equilibrium of someone who has at last learned how to inhabit herself. The woman who once sparkled across silver screens now finds her joy in the smallest of gestures. The morning sunlight catching the rim of her teacup, the laughter of her children echoing through an open door, the steady scratch of her pen against a notebook filled with gentle thoughts. She still receives letters from admirers, some young, some old, who remember her from different chapters of her life. Some recall the bombshell of the 50s, others the philosopher of the 70s, others the unexpected teacher who gave a lecture that changed the way they saw themselves. Jayne answers each one in her soft, looping handwriting, always with gratitude, never with distance. "Thank you," she writes often, "for remembering not who I was, but that I was." The words are simple, but carry the weight of an entire lifetime spent negotiating what it means to be seen. Her family, now grown, has become her truest source of pride. Mariska's acting career is beginning to bloom, not with the flash of celebrity, but with the steady strength of craft. Jayne watches her daughter on screen and feels both the echo of her own youth and the quiet thrill of transcendence. Mariska's performances are raw, deeply human, unafraid of imperfection. It feels to Jayne as though the path she began decades earlier toward authenticity, away from performance, has at last found completion through her child. When they speak by phone late at night, their voices melt into one another, mother and daughter joined by an invisible thread of understanding. "You've given me a map," Mariska says once, and Jayne smiles into the receiver, whispering, "Then promise me you'll keep rewriting it." Mickey remains part of her life, though their marriage, long transformed, now rests in the tender territory between friendship and family. They share holidays, quiet dinners, and the mutual affection of people who have known each other's every season. There's no regret in their separation, only gratitude that their story, once so public, has grown private again. When he visits, they often sit in the garden where she writes, talking of the past not as something lost, but as a tapestry they both helped weave. Sometimes, when the light grows soft and the air turns golden, she reaches for his hand, and they sit without words, two souls who once danced in the glare of cameras and somehow survived the fading of that brightness. The world's gaze, once a storm, has turned to something gentler. Filmmakers and historians now write about her as one of the transitional figures between the age of illusion and the age of authenticity. They invite her to speak at retrospectives and symposia, and though she declines most, she occasionally appears. Her presence quiet, her eyes clear. She no longer speaks of herself in the third person, as the old Hollywood stars often did. Instead, she speaks as one who has reconciled the woman and the myth, neither glorifying nor dismissing either. "She was me," she says simply when asked about her younger self, "and I am her. We grew up together." The audiences who listen are often moved not by nostalgia, but by the depth of her piece. Her writing continues, though it becomes less public and more meditative. Her notebooks fill with reflections on aging, on loss, on the delicate art of continuing. She writes about the garden, about the way certain flowers close when the sun sets and reopen without complaint each morning. She writes about music, the quiet piano pieces she plays to mark time, and she writes about forgiveness, the long process of forgiving not others, but herself. "There is a moment," she notes in one of her final essays, "when you realize you can love the person you once pretended to be. That is when peace begins." Fame visits her less often, though not entirely. Every few years, a magazine runs a feature on the real Jayne Mansfield, and her phone rings with calls from journalists wanting to hear her story once more. She answers kindly, but sparingly. "The real story," she tells one interviewer, "is that I stopped needing a story." The journalist pauses, caught off guard, and Jayne, seeing the confusion, adds gently, "When you no longer need to be remarkable, you finally become real." The interview is published in a small arts journal, and the quote finds its way across the country, passed between readers as though it were a line of poetry. She has begun to cherish her solitude as a companion rather than a void. Mornings find her on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, sipping tea as the first light stretches over the horizon. Sometimes she writes letters to friends who are long gone, Marilyn, Jean Harlow, the many ghosts of her generation who never had the chance to grow old. "We were all trying to live forever," she writes to them, "and in a way, we did, but not like we thought we would." She feels no bitterness in these imagined conversations, only the melancholy gratitude of one who has outlasted her own era. Visitors often remark on the tranquility of her home. There are no grand portraits, no trophies on display, only photographs of her family, a shelf of well-worn books, and an old piano by the window. She plays sometimes in the evenings, slow melodies that drift through the open air and seem to dissolve into the dusk. Her voice, when she sings quietly to herself, carries the warmth of memory, the tenderness of survival. To those who sit with her, time feels suspended, as though the world outside has forgotten its urgency. In these private years, Jayne begins to sense her life as a circle gently closing. She has traveled from the fever of desire to the calm of wisdom, from performance to presence. There are no regrets left, only lessons. She understands now that the meaning of her life was never in the applause or the headlines, but in the countless quiet moments between them, the mornings after, the silences before, the long walks through the gardens of thought. "Fame," she once wrote, "is a story people tell about you. But life, that's the story you tell yourself when no one's watching." The late 1980s drift into the early 1990s with little fanfare. Her face, now gently lined, has become softer, her gestures slower but assured. She spends her days reading letters from her students, watching her grandchildren play, and walking through the neighborhoods where no one recognizes her anymore. She loves that anonymity, that sweet erasure of identity. It feels like freedom. Sometimes, though, when she catches a glimpse of her younger self in a television documentary or an old photograph, she smiles and murmurs, "You did well, my dear. You did what you could." The world continues to change. Technology, culture, the pace of everything accelerating, but Jayne no longer feels the need to keep up. She lives at her own tempo, timeless and true. For her, peace is not withdrawal, but acceptance, not silence, but harmony. She has learned that the most profound lives are often the ones that learn to listen, and she has become a master of listening to the world, to memory, to her own quiet heart. And so, in this gentlest chapter of her life, Jayne Mansfield finds what so few ever do, a life that no longer performs itself. The audience is gone, the cameras have stopped, but the light remains, unflickering, inward, eternal. The 1990s dawn softly over Los Angeles, carrying with them an air of remembrance. It is a decade enamored with retrospection. Old songs return to the airwaves, vintage film reels find new audiences, and the glamour of a bygone age is rediscovered by a generation that never lived it. Jayne Mansfield, now in her late 50s, watches this with a strange tenderness. The world she once knew as an electric present has become an archive, a series of flickering memories projected on screens and cataloged in coffee table books. Yet she does not feel old in this world of reflection. Rather, she feels like one who has learned to live inside time itself, not chasing it nor resisting it, but listening to its rhythm as one listens to a friend's breathing in the dark. television channels begin to air documentaries about the Hollywood she once embodied. Narrators speak of Monroe, of Dean, of the lost innocence of cinema. Inevitably, her name appears among them, accompanied by images of a laughing young woman in pink, eyes bright, voice playful. The world remembers that version of Jayne as a symbol, a moment of optimism crystallized in celluloid. When producers reach out to interview her for these programs, she hesitates at first. Part of her wonders what good could come from revisiting a life already rewritten. But when she finally agrees, it is not out of vanity, but of gratitude. She feels it is her duty to speak for those who no longer can. The studio where they film her interview is quiet, lit in warm gold rather than the harsh white of her youth. Jayne sits in a simple armchair, her posture graceful, her hair now fully silver but luminous in its own right. The interviewer, a young woman who grew up watching her films on late-night television, begins gently, asking what she remembers most about the golden age. Jayne smiles, looking somewhere beyond the camera, into a space where the past still hums softly. "We believed in beauty," she says after a long pause, "but not the cruel kind. We believed beauty could heal people, could make them forget the darkness for a moment. Perhaps we were wrong, but we meant well." Her voice trembles slightly, not from fragility but from depth, like a cello note sustained a breath too long. When the documentary airs, viewers are astonished by her presence. The press writes of her as the ghost who returned with a heartbeat, and audiences, many seeing her speak for the first time outside the roles she once played, find themselves unexpectedly moved. Letters pour in again, not from admirers but from contemporaries, from women her age who see in her interview a mirror of their own journeys. They thank her for surviving, for aging publicly, for refusing to disappear. One woman writes, "When I saw you, I stopped fearing my own wrinkles." Jayne reads these letters late into the night, her eyes wet with the kind of tears that cleanse rather than wound. The rediscovery of her image brings new invitations, retrospectives, symposiums, curated exhibitions, yet she approaches each one with discernment, understanding that nostalgia is a fragile thing, capable of both tenderness and distortion. At one such event, a museum mounts an exhibition titled "Women of the Silver Screen, Then and Now." Jayne attends the opening, walking slowly through corridors lined with portraits of actresses long gone. She stops before a large photograph of her younger self, the famous publicity still from "The Girl Can't Help It." She studies it quietly, taking in the flawless skin, the mischievous grin, the naive pride glowing from that immortalized face. "She looks so alive," says a woman standing beside her, not realizing whom she's speaking to. Jayne smiles gently and answers, "She was, and she still is in her way." The woman nods without recognizing her, and Jayne moves on, her heart strangely light. As the decade deepens, she becomes something of a bridge between eras. Young filmmakers seek her insight about the old systems, the studio hierarchies, the way women once navigated power with wit instead of anger because anger was forbidden. Jayne, ever generous, shares what she knows, neither bitter nor self-congratulatory. "We did what we could with what we had," she tells them. "You'll do the same. The fight is the same, only the costumes change." They listen, scribbling notes, realizing they are in the presence of someone who has transformed pain into philosophy. Her daughter's career, now rising steadily, fills Jayne with a quiet pride she rarely speaks aloud. Watching Mariska perform, she feels a sense of completion that no award or fame could ever provide. Here, embodied in her child, is the continuation of everything she once tried to prove, that women can be both tender and strong, beautiful and wise, public and private, all at once. When she visits her daughter on set, the crew treats her with reverence, aware of who she is but too respectful to gush. She sits quietly behind the camera, watching her daughter deliver a scene, and when the director calls "cut," she claps softly, whispering, "You've made peace with the camera. That's all I ever wanted." At home, Jayne's days follow a gentle pattern. She writes in the mornings, walks in the afternoon, and welcomes friends for tea in the evenings. She keeps her windows open, letting the scent of the sea drift through her rooms. Sometimes she writes poetry, though she never publishes it. Her verses are small meditations on impermanence, on the strange kindness of memory. Time, she writes in one poem, is not a thief, but a curator. It takes what we cannot keep and polishes what we must remember. These lines remain unpublished, but are found years later in her notebooks, each word written with a careful, loving hand. As the century nears its end, television networks begin producing grand retrospectives about Hollywood's golden age. Jayne is invited to narrate one such series, her voice providing continuity between fragments of history. It is a perfect role. She, who once embodied the fleeting, now giving it permanence. Her narration is slow and tender, almost maternal in tone. When she speaks about Marilyn Monroe, her voice falters slightly, then recovers. She was a comet, Jayne says, too bright to last, but bright enough to teach us to look up. Of herself, she says nothing, allowing her silence to be its own testimony. The program ends with a simple image. Jayne's hand turning off an old film projector, her reflection caught in the fading light. The scene feels final, like a benediction. The show airs to critical acclaim, but what matters most to Jayne is not the praise but the letters that follow. Letters from people who thank her for giving their parents' era back its dignity. She reads them sitting by her garden window, the same spot where decades earlier she wrote her first essays. The world, it seems, has come full circle. Fame, which once devoured her youth, now returns to her gently, like an old companion who finally remembers its manners. In the quiet of one of those evenings, she looks into a mirror. Not the cruel, bright one of Hollywood dressing rooms, but the soft, forgiving mirror by her bedroom door. The woman who looks back is lined and silver-haired, her beauty aged into something deeper, calmer, truer. "We survived," she murmurs to the reflection. "We all did, in our own way." And for the first time in her long life, she feels no distance between the woman she was and the woman she is. The mirror, that once merciless judge, has become her friend. By the mid-1990s, Jayne Mansfield has become what she never imagined she could be, a keeper of wisdom. The once blinding aura that surrounded her name has softened into something like reverence, and those who come to see her now do not seek starlight. They seek understanding. She lives quietly in her home near the hills, surrounded by shelves of books, photographs of her family, and a small garden that glows with the patience of things that have known both drought and bloom. Each morning she wakes before sunrise, makes tea, and writes at her desk while the world still sleeps. These pages, letters, meditations, fragments of thought, are her new performances. They have no audience but the dawn, and yet they may be the most profound work she ever creates. The younger generation of artists begins to find their way to her door. Some are actors and writers. Others are simply dreamers, uncertain how to live under the gaze of a society that demands spectacle. They sit at her kitchen table, often nervous, until she puts them at ease with a slow smile and a story from her own tangled past. She never lectures. She listens first, asking them what they truly want, then responding with quiet, unhurried candor. "The world will always try to name you," she tells them. "Your only task is to keep naming yourself." Her words are simple, but those who hear them leave changed. Many later say she taught them how to breathe again, how to walk back toward themselves when the noise became too loud. By now, her daughter's success has blossomed fully. Mariska is building her own career, one shaped not by imitation but by the inheritance of resilience. Jayne watches her daughter's rise with awe and humility, knowing the cycle of light continues in a gentler form. When she visits Mariska on set, she stands in the corner quietly, invisible to all but those who know her. She never offers advice unless asked, and when she does, it is always brief, a whisper of experience distilled into compassion. "Remember," she tells her one afternoon, "fame is only a mirror. You don't have to live inside it." Mariska nods, understanding more than she says, and later confides to friends that her mother taught her how to survive beauty, not just embody it. Jayne's reemergence in public life continues, though it carries no trace of ambition. Invitations arrive for her to speak at universities, film festivals, and women's conferences. She accepts a few each year, traveling with a small notebook and a sense of calm that seems to envelop everyone she meets. When she steps onto a stage now, there is no nervousness, no performance, only presence. Her voice, lower and steadier with age, carries the rhythm of reflection. "When I was young," she tells an audience at a women's symposium in 1996, "I thought freedom meant being adored. Now I know it means being left alone long enough to understand who you are." The room grows silent. The applause that follows quiet but sustained. In those moments, she feels that her life, once scattered by the winds of fame, has gathered itself into coherence. The industry that once used her as ornament now seeks her as oracle. Directors consult her on portrayals of female characters. Actors quote her essays in interviews. One night, she receives a call from a producer who tells her that a group of women at a major studio have formed a mentoring circle inspired by her lectures. They call it the Mansfield Table, a place where actresses meet not to compete, but to share their fears, to speak without judgment. The news moves her deeply. "I wanted to build something that would last," she writes in her journal that night. "Perhaps I already have." That same year, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences announces that Jayne Mansfield will receive an honorary Oscar for her lifetime contribution to film and culture. The announcement surprises her. She had long stopped imagining herself in such rooms, but she accepts with quiet gratitude. The night of the ceremony, she steps onto the stage slowly, guided by the applause of generations. Her silver hair gleams softly under the lights, her gown simple, her smile unguarded. For a moment, the entire audience rises to its feet. She stands there, humbled, blinking against the brightness that once defined her life. When she begins to speak, her voice trembles slightly, not from age, but from emotion. "I once thought beauty was a crown," she says, "something you wore until it slipped away. But now I know it's a candle, meant to be shared, not kept. Every person who ever looked at me gave me their light, and tonight I give it back." She pauses, looking out at the sea of faces, some young, some old, all listening with rapt stillness. "If I have learned anything," she continues, "it is that we do not live to be remembered. We live to remember." Her words hang in the air long after she leaves the stage. The cameras catch her wiping a tear as she sits down, Mickey squeezing her hand gently, Mariska's proud gaze shining from across the aisle. After the ceremony, she avoids the after-parties, choosing instead to drive home quietly through the sleeping city. The streets are empty, the moon pale over the hills. When she reaches her house, she slips off her shoes, sets the gold statue on the piano, and sits in silence. The room feels warm, the kind of warmth that comes not from fire but from memory. She looks at the Oscar for a long time, then smiles faintly. "It's beautiful," she murmurs, "but not as beautiful as peace." She turns off the light, leaving the little statue gleaming softly in the dark, like a small, patient star. The following years are marked by contentment. She continues to write, short pieces, letters to editors, quiet reflections published in small journals. Her topics range from the philosophy of attention to the ethics of art. Scholars quote her more often now than critics once mocked her, and her words appear in anthologies beside thinkers she once read in secret as a young woman. Sometimes, at dusk, she rereads her old notebooks and marvels at how far she has come. "I began as an imitation," she writes, "and became a conversation." That line, though she never intends it as such, becomes her epitaph in spirit. In her final lectures, she often speaks about legacy. "We think of legacy as something left behind," she tells her students, "but it's really what you plant in others that keeps growing after you're gone. They ask her how she'd like to be remembered, and she answers simply, kindly, if possible, and honestly. When the laughter subsides, she adds, "The truth is always kinder than the myth." Her home remains a gathering place, a quiet sanctuary where old friends drop in unannounced, where laughter still echoes and the air still smells faintly of jasmine. She has outlived many of her peers, and though loss touches her often, she greets it without fear. "We are all temporary masterpieces," she writes one spring evening. "The beauty lies in the unfinished." It is in these later years, surrounded by family, students, and kindred spirits, that Jayne Mansfield becomes something more enduring than famous. She becomes beloved. She has turned her life into a lesson, her wounds into wisdom, and her beauty into an offering. And as she sits in her garden one twilight, the sun dipping behind the palms, she closes her eyes and feels the soft hum of life around her, the murmur of voices she has touched, the gentle persistence of the world she has forgiven. The light lingers on her face for a long moment before fading, as if reluctant to leave. The mentor's gift, she realizes, is not knowledge but presence, the quiet assurance that every story, if lived long enough, becomes its own redemption. The century turns once more, and Jayne Mansfield moves through her 70s as though time itself has become her companion rather than her pursuer. The world around her changes with dizzying speed. Cell phones hum where typewriters once clicked, movie stars now exist in pixels instead of flesh, and fame has become a thing of algorithms rather than adoration. Yet she remains, still and luminous, a figure of quiet endurance in an age that has forgotten the patience of being. Her silver hair, soft and loose, frames a face etched with kindness. The lines that once might have been called wrinkles are now maps, evidence of laughter, of sorrow survived, of living fully. The public remembers her now not as a symbol of glamour, but as one of those rare souls who made peace with all her selves. She spends her mornings, as she always has, writing. Her hand, slower now but steady, moves across the page with deliberate care. The essays she produces in these years are brief, more like meditations than arguments, full of grace and acceptance. Some are published, many are not. One piece, titled On Vanishing, appears in a literary magazine in 2003 and draws quiet acclaim. "The older I grow," she writes, "the more I understand that disappearance is not loss, but transformation. We are not meant to be constant. We are meant to dissolve, to pass through time like sunlight through leaves, leaving behind warmth, but not weight." Readers send her letters describing how her words have comforted them through grief, aging, and change. Jayne responds to as many as she can, sometimes with paragraphs, sometimes with a single sentence. "Thank you for listening when I had only silence to offer." Her family gathers around her more frequently now. Mariska, at the height of her career, comes often with her husband and their growing family. Jayne delights in her grandchildren, who know her not as a legend, but simply as Nana Jayne, the gentle woman who tells stories about the old movie days while trimming roses in the garden. They listen wide-eyed, imagining her past not as tragedy or spectacle, but as adventure. She tells them little pieces of truth, how she once met Elvis in a dressing room, and how he sang her a verse from a gospel song, how she once danced barefoot on a soundstage at midnight just to hear her own laughter echo. But she also tells them quieter lessons, how love must bend like light, how forgiveness is a kind of bravery, how beauty without empathy fades too soon. They nod without fully understanding, but the wisdom settles into them nonetheless, the way sunlight seeps slowly into soil. The house she lives in now is smaller, simpler, filled with the objects of a long, layered life. On the walls hang framed photographs not of her most famous moments, but of the unrecorded ones. Her children at the beach, her father in his study, Mickey lifting a child into the air. On her writing desk sits a vase of lavender and an old fountain pen, whose nib has been replaced more than once. Beside it rests a framed quote she once wrote to herself on a torn envelope. "Do not be afraid of the quiet. It is the sound of truth breathing." As her health begins to wane, she withdraws gently from public life. She turns down speaking invitations and television appearances, choosing instead to correspond privately with friends and students. Yet even in retreat, her influence endures. Young actresses who never met her still speak of her in interviews as a guiding figure, a model of reinvention and endurance. Some quote her old essays. Others describe how her story taught them that survival is a kind of art. Jayne reads these mentions sometimes, smiling faintly. "If my mistakes can spare someone else a little pain," she writes in her diary, "then I've made peace with all of them." Her days pass quietly, marked by rituals she has built over decades. The sound of a record turning on the old phonograph, the scent of jasmine tea, the soft creak of her porch chair as she watches the sun fade into the Pacific. The garden is her favorite place now, the last stage she will ever need. She tends it not with urgency, but with devotion, whispering to the plants as though they are old friends. "We're not so different, are we?" she says once, laughing softly to herself. "We both reach for the light and let the rest fall away." Sometimes she receives visits from journalists, though they are fewer now. They come not to uncover scandal or spectacle, but to listen. One asks her, late in 2004, what she thinks of the new century's obsession with youth and fame. Jayne considers the question for a long moment before replying, "Every generation thinks it invented vanity, but what they're really searching for is belonging. They just don't know where to look." Her words, delivered with warmth rather than judgment, become one of the most quoted lines of the interview. The journalist leaves her home feeling lighter, as though something fragile yet essential had been restored. In these twilight years, Jayne's relationship with time becomes almost mystical. She speaks of it as though it were alive, a companion that has both tested and protected her. "Time," she writes in one of her last notebooks, "is not the river that carries us away. It is the water we become." Her reflections have shed all performance, all striving. They are written in the tone of someone who has finally learned to speak directly from the heart without fear of misunderstanding. She dreams often of the people who shaped her, the father who lived long enough to see her become herself, the friends lost to fame's hunger, the many versions of her own soul. In these dreams, they are all walking toward her on a quiet beach, bathed in soft evening light. No one speaks. They simply gather together, smiling, and she feels the serenity of being complete. When she wakes from such dreams, she does not feel sadness. She rises, makes her tea, and writes, as if time itself were still whispering its lessons to her. The winter of 2005 finds her health faltering more noticeably. Her energy diminishes, but her spirit remains bright. She writes to Mariska, "I feel as though the curtain is lowering, but what a stage it has been. I do not fear the dark, for I have learned it is only the other side of light." Her daughter keeps that letter folded in her wallet for the rest of her life. As the new year dawns, Jayne begins to spend more time resting, her notebooks now filled with half-finished sentences, as though language itself is slowing to match her breath. Yet even in her final entries, her clarity endures. The last words she writes are found weeks later in her journal, barely legible, but unmistakable. "I was here. I was loved. I learned to see." The days grow shorter, the evenings quieter. Her family gathers close, and when she drifts to sleep, it is with the serenity of someone who has already said everything worth saying. She has carried her legend to its gentlest conclusion, not erased it, but transformed it. The woman who once lived under relentless light has finally found her peace in shadow. The morning of June 29, 2006, arrives softly, wrapped in the pale hush of summer light. The house is quiet except for the rustle of leaves outside the window and the rhythmic breath of a woman who has traveled long enough to deserve her rest. Jayne Mansfield, now 73, lies in her bed surrounded by the traces of her own long story. Books she has read and written, photographs of the family she raised, letters tied neatly in ribbon, pressed flowers between journal pages, fragile proofs of a life fully inhabited. The air smells faintly of lavender and paper. Through the open window comes the distant hum of Los Angeles, the city that made and unmade her, now softened to a lullaby. Her daughter sits beside her, holding her hand, and in the stillness between them there is no fear. There's only a silence so complete it feels like gratitude. When the moment comes, it is gentle. Her breathing slows, her fingers relax, and her gaze turns toward the light falling across the curtains. Her daughter leans close and hears her whisper something barely audible. It was beautiful. Then her eyes close, and she is gone. Not dramatically, not as legend, but as a woman who has finished her long conversation with the world. The candle has burned steadily to its end, and what remains is not darkness but glow. News of her passing spreads quickly, and yet it is received not with the shock of tragedy but with the tenderness of farewell. Newspapers across the world print her photograph, not the exaggerated poses of youth, but the recent images. Silver hair, calm smile, eyes luminous with peace. The headlines call her the star, who lived beyond the myth, Hollywood's philosopher, the woman who outshone her own legend. For once, the words written about her are worthy of the woman herself. Her death does not reopen scandal or gossip. It invites reflection. Reporters note how rare it is for a public figure, especially one once synonymous with glamour, to die without spectacle. They call it her final act of grace. The funeral is small, private, and filled with light. Held in a chapel overlooking the Pacific, it gathers not the glittering elite of her early years, but those who truly knew her. Her children, her grandchildren, old friends, former students, and a few quiet admirers who had become family through correspondence. There are no paparazzi, no flashing bulbs, only candles flickering gently in the sea breeze that drifts through the open doors. A pianist plays Debussy softly as her family stands together, and when Mariska speaks, her voice trembles with love. "My mother taught me that fame can fade, but dignity doesn't," she says. "She showed us how to keep our hearts intact in a world that asks you to trade them for attention. She didn't escape her story. She rewrote it." When the service ends, they scatter her ashes in the ocean, as she once requested. The waves carry them outward, dispersing them like pale smoke beneath the sun. The water folds her back into itself, and for a moment it seems as if the entire horizon glows. A long, endless shimmer, neither sorrow nor joy, but something larger than both. The family stands watching until the sea is calm again. Mariska takes a small step forward and whispers, "Good night, Mama." The waves answer in their own rhythm, eternal and patient. In the months that follow, tributes appear in quiet corners of the world. Universities dedicate symposiums to her writings. A foundation in her name is established to support women in film studies, carrying forward her lifelong devotion to teaching. A new generation discovers her essays and begins to quote her, not as a star, but as a thinker. "Survival," one of her lines reads, "is the most overlooked art form." It appears on posters, on classroom walls, even in the footnotes of academic texts. Her words, once confined to the small audience of her later years, now reach the world she never sought to impress. Fame, at last, has caught up to her truth. Hollywood, too, remembers. At the next Academy Awards ceremony, a short tribute segment plays in her honor. The montage opens with the image of her young self laughing on set, then slowly transitions to footage from her later interviews, her voice calm, her tone wise. As the sequence ends, her words echo through the theater. "We do not live to be remembered. We live to remember." The audience stands in silence. Many who never met her wipe tears from their eyes, sensing that they are mourning not only a woman, but an era, and perhaps even something of themselves, the belief that it is possible to live fully and still end in peace. Her home becomes a place of pilgrimage for a time. Students, scholars, and admirers come to see the garden where she once wrote, the piano where her honorary Oscar still sits, the window that framed her favorite view of the Pacific. Everything remains as she left it. The notebooks stacked neatly, the books marked with careful underlines, the faint smell of jasmine lingering in the air. It feels less like a museum than a sanctuary, a space still humming with thought. In the years to come, that home will be preserved by her family, its doors open to those who seek inspiration rather than memorabilia. Time, which once threatened to erase her, now keeps her safe. Her story becomes a lesson in endurance, a testament to the possibility that fame, though fleeting, can give way to wisdom if one survives long enough to see through it. Scholars call her the bridge between the Hollywood of dreams and the modern age of self-awareness. Artists quote her lines about light and forgiveness. Feminists study her reinvention as an early act of agency. Every group finds something in her, and somehow all are right. She belongs not to one story, but to many. And yet, beyond all the tributes and analysis, what remains most vivid is her humanity. The laughter that still lingers in her family's memories, the warmth that filled her home, the kindness she extended to those who arrived at her door, uncertain and searching. Friends remember how she always paused before answering a question, how she listened completely before speaking. She had nothing left to prove, one of her students recalls years later, so every word she spoke was a gift. In the end, Jayne Mansfield's life feels less like a straight line and more like a circle, beginning in innocence, spiraling through illusion, suffering, discovery, and finally returning to simplicity. The woman who once represented Hollywood's hunger for spectacle becomes its quiet conscience, a symbol of what can endure when the lights go out. Her journey defies tragedy because it ends in understanding. She dies not as a fallen star, but as a whole soul, one who met fame, survived it, and left behind something gentler than legend, wisdom. As evening falls on the day of her passing, the sea glows with the faint afterlight of sunset. The waves roll in, unhurried, endless, carrying her story with them. Somewhere beyond the horizon, her laughter lingers, mingling with the wind. And for those who remember her, not the image but the woman, it feels as though she has not vanished at all. She has simply become light again, returning to the sky from which she first descended. Years have passed since Jayne Mansfield's voice fell silent, and yet her presence remains, dispersed but alive, like perfume lingering in an empty room. The world has moved through new centuries, new idols, new illusions, and still the light she carried, quiet, forgiving, and human, glows in unexpected corners. Each generation rediscovers her, not through the sensational images that once defined her, but through the traces of thought she left behind. Her words appear on screens and in books, whispered by professors, quoted by artists, printed on postcards in small art shops. The woman who once embodied the ephemeral now endures in the language of reflection. It is as though time, having taken so much from her youth, has given it all back to her spirit. Her home by the sea remains a sanctuary. The garden continues to bloom every spring, the jasmine still fragrant, the light still falling in slanted golden ribbons through her writing room. Visitors often describe a strange serenity there, as if the air itself remembers her stillness. Scholars who come to study her papers find themselves lingering in silence after reading her last journals, moved not by grandeur, but by the tenderness of her words. "We spend half our lives searching for applause," she wrote once, "and the other half learning to live without it." Those who read the line tend to close the book gently, as if afraid to break its spell. In lectures and documentaries, her story has become a parable, not of tragedy, but of transformation. Teachers speak of her not as the doomed starlet of tabloid lore, but as the rare figure who lived long enough to translate her own myth into meaning. She has become, in cultural memory, a mirror through which people examine the cost of being seen and the grace of being known. Her life reminds audiences that survival itself can be art, and that wisdom is often born not from triumph, but from endurance. The myth of Jayne Mansfield has softened into the memory of a woman who learned to forgive the world for misunderstanding her, and, in doing so, taught it how to see her clearly. Those who knew her in her later years remember not her words first, but her presence. The way she carried silence like a garment, how her laughter seemed to warm the air, how her gaze, steady and unhurried, made whoever sat across from her feel entirely visible. One former student recalls visiting her during her final months. "She didn't talk about death," the student said. "She talked about light, how it changes shape, how it never really disappears, only moves elsewhere." That simple thought, offered with a faint smile and a cup of tea, became a comfort to many after her passing. Even in absence, she continues to teach. Her writings are studied now not for celebrity gossip, but for their quiet philosophy. Universities assign her essays on media, perception, and identity. Filmmakers quote her reflections on illusion. Women still find courage in her story, how she turned objectification into authorship, how she found humility without surrender. Each retelling adds new hues to her portrait. For some, she's an emblem of feminist awakening. For others, a poet of impermanence. For most, simply a woman who found her way home through the labyrinth of fame. Mariska keeps her mother's memory alive not through myth, but through continuity. She speaks of her not as an icon, but as a guide. In interviews, she recalls the gentleness that lay beneath the legend, the humor, the strength disguised as softness. "My mother lived many lives," she says once, "and I think she's still living them through every woman who learns that beauty and depth can coexist." Those words travel far, echoing across generations that know Jayne only through images, but now sense something truer stirring behind them. Sometimes, on quiet evenings by the Pacific, admirers still gather near the shore where her ashes were scattered. They come without ceremony, students, writers, old fans with weathered photographs. They bring flowers, light candles, and read aloud passages from her later writings. The ocean wind carries their voices outward, blending them into one long breath of remembrance. The waves shimmer faintly as the sun sinks, and for a moment it is easy to believe that she is still here, listening. Perhaps she always will be, scattered like light itself, everywhere, yet belonging to no single place. History tends to remember the loud, the tragic, the spectacular. But Jayne Mansfield's enduring legacy lies in her quiet triumph, that she outlasted her own noise. She proved that a life can move from spectacle to silence and still shine with meaning. Her story, stretched across decades, became a kind of music, rising, breaking, softening, and finally resolving into calm. The woman who once chased immortality through fame discovered it instead through grace. In the final measure of things, her journey suggests something timeless about the human heart, that it is possible to outgrow illusion without bitterness, to forgive the world for misunderstanding beauty, to transform pain into peace. Her life whispers that the end of one era need not be the end of wonder, that we are all, in our own ways, capable of survival, reinvention, and light. And so, when people speak of Jayne Mansfield now, it is often in the language of gratitude rather than sorrow. They speak of the woman who lived beyond her legend, who walked through the wreckage of her own myth and emerged whole. They speak of the calm she found, the truth she shared, the enduring warmth she left behind. She has become, at last, what she was always meant to be, not a figure frozen in beauty, but a light passed gently from one heart to another. Some nights, When the ocean is still and the moon hangs low over Los Angeles, the waves seem to shimmer with a faint silver glow. Those who stand at the water's edge might feel, if only for a moment, that the light on the surface is her, returning, refracted, reminding us that nothing loved, nothing understood ever truly disappears. It changes shape, it drifts, it becomes air, reflection, memory. Jayne Mansfield lives there still, beyond the reach of cameras and stories, in that quiet, eternal light where all things, fame, youth, loss, forgiveness, finally find their home.